Hello and welcome to the second lecture of this particular course, Introduction to Cultural Studies. So I spent a good deal of time in the first lecture talking about the idea of culture as a construct, as an activity, as a category of, as a process which is happening all the time, as a process of becoming, unbecoming, rebecoming, and how, more importantly, it's a combination of material and abstract attributes. And this combination is very, very useful to look at culture, rather than culture being a static, inorganic entity. Now, what I'll do today is I'll sort of look at the way in which culture can be looked at, can be examined very, very gainfully. So these are some of the ways which we can look at culture. They can produce different interpretations of culture, and sometimes their interpretations can correlate, sometimes they can converge in very interesting ways. So Marxism, gender studies, psychology, affect studies, and memory studies. So these are, obviously this is by no means an exhaustive list. You can add on more disciplines, but these are generally the kind of broad disciplines which we'll use for the purpose of this particular course to look at culture. So, and the other thing is, you find that these studies, these disciplines often, sort of are dialoguing with each other. So we can't have Marxism apart from gender studies or apart from psychology or affect studies and memory studies as different categories of discipline. They're not so. They often converge. There's a lot of dialogue going on. There's a very interdisciplinary way of looking at culture. And, this is something I said at the very first lecture, the culture as a term doesn't really belong to any particular disciplinary realm. So there cannot be anything called cultural studies which doesn't take into account, gender studies or psychology or political science. Marxism, of course, is a component of political science to a certain extent, or literature or memory studies. So all these things come into play very, very creatively, very, very complexly when we look at culture, especially the way we define culture as a act of production, as an activity, as an organic activity, process of becoming. So let's begin with Marxism. What is Marxism? And I'm sure all of you are aware of what is Marxism. It's a particular way of looking at culture. It's a particular system of examining culture, a particular model of looking at culture. So the very broad definition of Marxism could be, it's a way of examining culture as an entanglement of base and superstructure. While the base for classical Marxism or Marxists is almost always economic, the superstructure is built on such economic determinism and constitutes culture, cultural identities, and cultural codes such as language, dress, food, manners, and values. So again, this play between base and superstructure is something that Marxism offers us as a discipline. Now, it's by no means right to say that this is a rigid binary. The base is something and superstructure is something else. Base and superstructure are dialoguing with each other, and that's something which we should be aware of, especially as people who look at Marxism from a modern lens, right? So the base is economic. So what do I mean when I say the base is economic? So Marxists or classical Marxists, they look at culture as some kind of economic activity, something which is produced out of modes of production, the politics of production, issues of ownership, issues of agency, issues of commodity, etc. So these become part of the cultural process, right? And any act of culture, any activity in culture, which is art, language, religion, dress, etc., are sort of manifestations or extensions of these economic activities, right? So that's a very broad way of looking at the base superstructure model. The superstructure, of course, is a lofty structure of a particular culture, and that can constitute religion, that can constitute faith, that can constitute language, that can constitute literature, high art, etc. So culture for classical Marxist scholars is largely, therefore, a mode of production whereby material as well as abstract attributes such as art, literature, and identities are produced and reproduced. And again, the idea of production and reproduction is important because, it's not just production, it's endless reproduction. And, the more you reproduce something, the more you disseminate something. And the more you disseminate something, the more that something gets consumed. And that's how something becomes hegemonic in the first place. So as I mentioned in the first lecture, the act of becoming hegemonic, the act of making something hegemonic is by process of production, endless production and reproduction, right? Now, this activity of production and reproduction happens in various covert as well as overt economic conditions. So sometimes economic conditions are explicit. You walk into a big factory and you see an act of production. That's explicit production. That's overt production. But sometimes, more complexly, the production is, covert or implicit. You don't see it. You walk into a massive shopping mall, a massive departmental store, and you see lovely little commodities, lovely little goods which you can purchase, and you're not aware that they are produced at some point in time. You just consume this as ready-made commodities, right? So the difference between a factory and a shopping mall is exactly this. The factory is a sort of explicit production. It's absolutely overt production, whereas the shopping mall is an act of covert production. The production is sort of hidden, is not really visible along with the commodity. So culture in classic Marxist theory often emerges as an industry where material as well as absolute attributes are produced and consumed. So culture as an industry is something that we are very, very interested in, especially in cultural studies. If you look at cultural studies from a Marxist lens, we find that the culture industry becomes a very important factor. So by the word industry, the Marxist obviously means a spectacular mode of production and dissemination and consumption. And if you look at it even generically, it's interesting to understand that culture is something which we consume all the time. So when you say, I want to be a cultured person, I want to be a cultivated person, what you really want to do is you want to consume the particular codes which would make you cultural, which would make you cultivated, right? So there is an act of consumption in culture. There's an act of production in culture. You produce certain codes, you also consume certain codes. So culture as an industry would make a lot of sense, really, especially if you're looking at it from a Marxist perspective. Right, now, the idea of culture industry was powerfully evoked by the Frankfurt School of Marxism, and this is a very interesting and very famous school of Marxism in Germany, Frankfurt, which produced some of the finest philosophers and thinkers of the 20th century, most prominently represented by Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno. So these are two, you might say, poster boys for the Frankfurt School of Marxism, who produced great works of Marxism, great works of cultural theory, and they sort of looked at culture as an industry, as a culture as a sort of mass production, right? And of course, the idea of mass production is to look at how a degree of standardization happens. So when you want to make something mass, when you want to make something mass production, the idea is to make it standardized, to make it uniform, to cut away all unique edges, and to make it one solid, standardized form of entertainment, form of consumption, which can be reproduced endlessly. You find a model, you find a prototype, a very standard prototype, and you keep producing it endlessly, right? So in an influential work entitled The Culture Industry, Enlightenment as Mass Deception, and I use the word deception over here very, very deliberately, Horkheimer and Adorno examined the strategic standardization produced by mass culture, which appropriates mechanic modes of production as well as consumption, whereby the producer as well as the consumer are alienated at a human level from the production process as well as from the finished product. Now, this is a very loaded little description, and I'll spend some time on it. Now, what is happening over here, what these people argue in this very, very famous work, The Culture Industry, Enlightenment as Mass Deception, is that, the public which is consuming the cultural product is basically being deceived, because what they're consuming is a commodity. So culture becomes a commodity in the hands of certain, industrialists, in the hands of certain, capitalists who are producing culture, who are producing cultural signifiers such as films, radio, television, music. So all this become industry, right? So this very quick transition from culture to industry is something which is examined in this particular essay. This particular work. And as consumers of culture, we are essentially looking at culture as some kind of a gift, some kind of a ready-made food, a ready-made garment, which we can quickly use, can quickly conform to, and in the process we too are getting standardized. So what happens in this idea of mass consumption, this act of mass consumption, is the producer as well as the consumer are alienated at a human level. And the word alienation is a very Marxist term. Whereas the alienation, again, this is a very interesting combination of sort of Marxism and psychology to a certain extent, and I will draw on psychology to a great extent in this particular course. So alienation is a removal from a certain location, right? So when you alienate it from your human self, and become a commodity, become a consumer of a commodity, that becomes a tragic process, moving away from a true human self and becoming a passive consumer of a standardized product. So, culture and the culture industry in the works of the Frankfurt School of Marxists becomes a standardized vehicle which is meant for consumption, right? And the act of consumption produces or generates the feeling of alienation in the masses. So the consumer is alienated from at a human level from the production process as well as from the finished product. Okay. So this is a longish quotation that from that particular essay, from that particular work by Horkheimer and Adorno. If you look at the quotation, you find that there are words such as violence. The violence becomes more open, so its power grows. Movies and radio need no longer pretend to be art. The truth that they are just business is made into an ideology in order to justify the rubbish they deliberately produce. They call themselves industries, and when the director's incomes are published, any doubt about the social utility of the finished products is removed. A technological rationale is the rationale of domination itself. It's a coercive nature of society alienated from itself. Automobiles, bombs, and movies keep the whole thing going together until the leveling element shows a strength and a very wrong which it furthered. It has made the technology of the culture industry no more than an achievement of standardization and mass production, sacrificing whatever involved a distinction between the logic of the work and that of the social system. In other words, what is described in very graphic details, very dramatic details, is the idea of making something into one uniform whole, a one numbed uniform whole, right? And if you look at the words over here, automobiles, bombs, and movies, the idea of combining bomb and movie is very interesting because you often hear the word blockbuster, right? You use the word blockbuster for cinema. The word blockbuster actually comes from destruction, military activities, like when you're dropping a bomb. And a building is destroyed in the process, that's called a blockbuster. That was how the word was originated. Now that word is now used for cinema, for a massively hit cinema, for a massively commercially successful cinema. We use the word blockbuster for something which is a huge hit in theaters. So again, the whole idea of success becomes commercial. The whole idea of success becomes an economic achievement, right? So the work of art is relegated. There's no work of art at all, according to this particular essay, and everything becomes a standardized mode of production, and which is consumed ad infinitum, ad nauseam, etc. Right? So the achievement of standardization and mass production, sacrificing whatever involved a distinction between the logic of the work and that of the social system, right? So the social system and the work, that logic which is there is done away with. Everything becomes a part of entertainment, everything becomes a part of consumption process, and that's how Horkheimer and Adorno look at major mainstream 20th century art, 20th century forms of production. Okay, and it's a very dystopian kind of an essay, but it gives us an idea of looking at culture as an industry, right? So to what extent is culture an industry? To what extent is culture, consumed as an industrialized product? Okay, so moving on with the Marxist understanding of culture, moving on with this idea of looking at culture from a Marxist lens, it's very useful to look at some of the terms which are used very often in Marxist theory, and I just here give you use some of the terms which are useful for this particular course: Ideological State Apparatus (ISA), Repressive State Apparatus (RSA), and Interpellation. Now, these terms were made famous, used by many people, but they were made famous most prominently by the Marxist critic Louis Althusser, who uses evocatively to examine how identities are informed and contained in repressive systems of control, right? So Althusser was someone who is a very famous Marxist critic, is famous for many things, and he's someone who used Marxism and psychoanalysis and psychology very effectively. So I'll use psychology later in this particular course, where you understand how psychology and Marxism can be combined together to look at culture in a very effective way. Now, so what are these terms? What are ISA, RSA, and interpellation? So let's take a look at some of the working definitions of these terms. ISA, so Ideological State Apparatus. So ISA refers to those institutions such as schools, colleges, you could also consider family as an example of ISA, and legislative offices which produce and protect the ideologies and codes of conduct that will protect the status quo. So again, the idea is to protect and preserve the status quo, right? To have some kind of a protection mechanism, some kind of a defense mechanism, and I say the ideological state apparatus, and those apparatus, including family, including religion, including schools, including colleges, including legislative offices, which should produce the laws. So those laws, those codes are produced out of the ISA apparatus, and those, of course, are meant to be conformed to by the subject, by the human subject. RSA refers to those institutions such as police stations, courtrooms, and detention barracks, army barracks, where any form of dissent will be punished corporeally as well as institutionally. So, RSA is a repressive state apparatus, something which will punish you, the apparatus which is designed to punish you if you dissent from the ideological state apparatus, if you dissent as a subject. So if you are a dissenting subject, if you're a non-conforming subject, then RSA could be used to bring you back, to align you back to the status quo. You could be imprisoned, you could be sentenced to confinement, you could be hospitalized. Again, I did not use the word hospital over here, but sometimes you can look at the very complex collusion between medicine and politics, which use biomedicine, how hospitals can be used to contain people who are dangerous, to contain madmen, quote-unquote madmen, because the word madness is a very interesting subject which can be studied, should be studied, and we will study it in cultural studies. Again, madness is something which brings psychology and ideology in a very interesting combination, right? So who is a mad person? And someone who's a dissenter, a potential problem will be a mad person. So RSA refers to those institutions which will repress you, which will punish you, contain you, etc. Now, interpellation is a very interesting term. Again, it combines psychology, it combines the mind and ideology. It's a process through which a self becomes a subject with an internalization of ideology, and that sometimes takes place through an unconscious process. So it's an act of internalization, right? How you internalize, how you consume an ideology without questioning it. And you internalize it to such an extent that you act as a passive subject. You act as a ready-made, passive, conforming subject to that particular ideology. And the process of internalization is called interpellation. So Althusser, he draws on Lacanian psychology. Jacques Lacan, a very famous psychoanalyst. So he's someone that Althusser draws on very interestingly to describe interpellation. So he describes interpellation as a miscognition. This is very, very complex, a misrecognition. So it's not really an act of recognition, but a misrecognition, because even before you have a will of your own, according to Althusser, you become a cultural subject, you become an ideological subject. So even before you become a human being, you become an ideological subject, because you're born into a family, you're born into a code, you're born into a narrative of values, and you conform, you consume those values, and in the process you become a conforming citizen, you become a conforming subject. So even before you're a human being, you become a subject. So this whole act involves misrecognition. It involves an idea of interpellation, which is a combination of misrecognition and conformation to a certain kind of code. Right, so the process operates retroactively, according to Althusser, as the individual is always already an ideological subject even before they are born. Right, so even before they're born, they become an ideological subject. So this whole idea of the subject formation is something which is very usefully described by Althusser. So these are three terms which I think are very useful if you're looking at culture from a Marxist lens: ISA, RSA, and interpellation. Of course, there are many more terms that you can add, there are many more terms that you can look at, but for the purpose of this particular course, we will stick to these terms. Right. Now, perhaps the biggest thing, the biggest contribution of Marxism in terms of looking at culture and cultural studies is the idea of dialectical materialism. Now, what is dialectical materialism? Again, you see the word materialism is already there in Marxism, and this is one of the offerings of Marxism in cultural studies, the idea of looking at culture as a material, as something which is not something abstract, not something lofty, not something elegant and rarefied, but something which is reified, something which is a very solid material process. So what is dialectical materialism? This can be broadly defined as a materialist examination of history, breaking away from the Hegelian humanism. So Marx breaks away from Hegel. This is a philosophical break. We need not go into details of it for this particular course, but for the purpose of this course, it's important to understand the break is from a Hegelian humanism to a materialist way of looking at history. Marx used the notion to study the productive capacity and relations of production, right? So again, Marx brings our attention to the very banal economic conditions of culture, right? How is culture produced? How is commodity produced? What is the politics of production? What is the politics of ownership? So how is excess production possible, right? And what happens to excess production? So excess production becomes a pile up. It becomes someone's property. Someone owns it, right? And how is ownership related to consciousness, right? So how is ownership related to collective consciousness? So when someone owns something, how do we sort of look up to the person in servitude, in obedience, in aberration, etc. So Marx provides an elegant definition of the materialist understanding of human history and a paradigm shift characterizing the same in an 1859 preface to this very famous book called A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy. So, this is a very, you're right in the heart of political science over here. And as I mentioned, I'm using Marxism as a component of political science to understand culture and cultural studies. So, this is one of the beauties as well as the complexities of cultural studies. It's notorious interdisciplinarity. It brings in all kinds of disciplines: political science, psychology, linguistics, literature, affect studies, memory studies, in order to understand what this phenomenon of culture is. So this particular book, A Contribution, written in 1859, 2 years after the Sipahi rebellion in India, a contribution to the critique of political economy, right? And what does Marx say in this critique? This is a longish quotation that I'm using from this book, A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy. So the idea is to look at the political superstructure, and to which corresponds definite forms of consciousness. So again, you see, even from the very beginning, the very inception of Marxism, you find consciousness becomes a very important category in Marxism, right? So this idea of how the inside, your inside, what you are as a self, what you are as a subject, what you are as a thinking person, how is that informed and influenced by what is outside? What is the economic environment outside? So this play between the economic environment outside and your inner self inside, this is what constitutes Marxism. And it's a very interesting way of looking at culture through this Marxist lens. So the mode of production, according to Marx, of material life conditions the general process of social, political, and intellectual life. So the mode of production influences intellectual life. And this is a very revolutionary thing to say, because what it does is it takes away the glamour of isolated artistic activity. So no artistic activity can happen in isolation. So every human being is a subject. Every human being is a subject to a certain cultural, political, economic condition. So no matter how revolutionary the art is, no matter how avant-garde the art is, it's part of the cultural condition, it's part of the material condition on that particular point of historical time. So it cannot be divorced from it entirely. So it is not, this is one of the most often quoted sentences in Marx. It is not the consciousness of men that determines existence, but the social existence that determines their consciousness. So Marx is not saying that it's not consciousness which determines existence, right? It is not the inner mind which influences how we live outside, how we look at the world outside. It's not that. The world outside determines how we look at ourselves. The world outside determines how we think. So it's the other way around. So it is the social existence, the world outside, the material conditions outside that determines consciousness. So it's a very revolutionary thing to say, right? So it completely breaks the boundaries between the inside and the outside. And it takes away the glamour of this thinking, isolated man, cut away from material conditions, cut away from the human conditions, and instead it offers the idea that the human conditions, the material conditions outside, those influence, those determine how we think inside, okay? So at a certain stage of development, the material productive forces of society come into conflict with the existing relations of production, or this merely expresses the same thing in legal terms with the property relations within the framework of which they are operated hitherto. From forms of development of the productive process forces, these relations turn into their fetters. Then begins an era of social revolution. The changes in the economic foundation lead sooner or later to the transformation of the whole immense superstructure. In studying such transformations, it is always necessary to distinguish between the material transformations of the economic conditions of production, which can be determined with the precision of natural science, and the legal, political, religious, artistic, or philosophic, in short, ideological forms in which men become conscious of this conflict and fight it out. Just as one does not judge an individual by what he thinks about himself, so one cannot judge such a period of transformation by its consciousness, but on the contrary, this consciousness must be explained from the contradictions of material life, from the conflict existing between the social forces of production and the relations of production. So this is what he means by dialectical materialism. So dialectic is a Hegelian term. It's a movement from, Hegel uses the term as a movement from a synthesis, thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. So we have argument A, we have argument against A, and the two synthesize and have a different argument. So this is how arguments move, this is how ideas move. This is how Hegel defines a dialectic as a movement from a thesis to an antithesis and then a synthesis. Now what Marx does, he revises Hegel, right? He says, this doesn't happen only at the level of idea, this happens at the level of material productions. So we have a certain kind of material production, and then we have the anti-kind of material production, a different kind, and the two come to conflict with each other. And then we have a different kind of material production which is produced. Right? So the materiality of dialectical process is useful over here. Right? This is a revision that Marx does on Hegel. So dialectics doesn't happen only at the level of ideas. Dialectic happens also at the level of production, right? And this is important to understand. And he says the consciousness of the change must be explained, this is the last sentence, must be explained from the contradictions of material life. So, the conflict of consciousness is produced out of the conflict of material life. So the material life influences consciousness, which is what he said at the beginning of this particular quotation. That it is not consciousness which brings about social existence, but social existence which brings about consciousness. It's how we think, depends on how we are. The external conditions outside, those determine how we think. So this is a very progressive, very revolutionary thing to say at that point of time. Right, so next we come to the play between materiality and abstraction that constitutes culture and cultural identity. And this idea of materiality and production, let's look at something like literature. So when we look at literature, we use literature as more or less an abstract activity. It's a work of fiction, it's a story, it's a beautiful imagination, etc. So that becomes very important for us. But this is a very interesting book, and I suggest you read it, Pierre Macquarie's A Theory of Literary Production. And he uses the word production quite deliberately over here. Because he wants to emphasize the productive process of literature. It's not an act of creation, it's an act of production. So, like Marx said, consciousness does not influence material conditions. Material conditions determine consciousness. So likewise, Macquarie over here is saying the literature, does not produce existence. Existence produces literature. So the kind of literature produced at a given point of time depends on the material conditions of that particular historical point of time, and it's important we pay attention to it, right? So he deliberately, in this particular book, replaces the word creation with production. And this is something he quotes in the book, page 68 from this particular book. The various theories of creation all ignore the process of making. Again, the process of making, the very material process of making. So theory of creation, a very lofty, elegant term, but that ignores completely the process of making. They omit any account of production. One can create undiminished. So paradoxically, creation is a release of what is already there. Or one is witness of a sudden apparition, and then creation is an eruption, an epiphany, a mystery. In both instances, any possible explanation of the change has been done away with. In the former, nothing has happened, and in the latter, what has happened is inexplicable. All speculation over man, the creator, is intended to eliminate a real knowledge. The creative process is precisely not a process, a labor. It's a religious formula to be found on funeral monuments. The word labor over here is a key word, I think. So he looks at literature as a labor. And again, this is a very original, unique, revolutionary thing to say. So he looks at literature as a labor activity, an activity which is produced out of certain material conditions. So when you're telling a story, essentially, you're telling a story of your times. You're telling a story out of your material times. So the story is produced by the external conditions. And this goes back to Marx, right? When he says consciousness is produced by the social existence, not the other way around, right? So this is what Marx said, and this is something which Macquarie, in this really, really interesting, remarkable book, I think, The Theory of Literary Production, sort of emphasizes again. he says, the idea of epiphany, mystery, imagination, creation. So all these things deliberately take your attention away from the material processes of these productions. But as Marxist theorists, as people who are studying cultural studies in a very serious, systematic kind of a way, using a Marxist lens, we should be aware of the labor component of the whole process. Right? Just to conclude this lecture, so we saw in the first lecture how culture, we talked about culture as a combination of materiality and abstraction, a combination of material conditions and abstract conditions. And now we move on to looking at culture using certain disciplinary lenses, Marxism, psychology, memory studies, etc. When you come to Marxism, we find one of the ways in which we look at culture, very interestingly, is to look at culture as a mode of economic production, right? An economic production which produces this unique superstructure, right? And the superstructure is something which is related to the structure, the base, the economic condition. So even when you're looking at something like literature, when you're reading Hamlet of Shakespeare, or Macbeth, or watching or seeing Da Vinci's Mona Lisa, we must be aware, we must be conscious of the economic material conditions which produce that. So any act of culture, any activity in culture is an extension of the economic condition, and we must never take our attention away from it. Right? So this concludes our second lecture for this particular course. Next lecture, we will be looking at the question of identity. So how is identity produced, and how is hegemonic identity produced, and conversely, more interestingly, how is the identity of the other produced? The process of othering, how does the process of othering happen through a combination of economic, material, as well as profound psychological processes? So thank you for your attention, and I'll see you in the next lecture. Thank you.